What is the true value of a single moment of kindness? For Alistair Finch, a man who could buy anything in the world, the answer was priceless. He was a titan of industry, a billionaire whose life was a fortress of glass and steel. But when he saw his grieving son alone and silently crying in a cheap diner, he was powerless. And then he saw her, a simple waitress with tired eyes and a gentle hand who did something no amount of money could ever replicate. He watched her wipe away his son's tears, and in that moment, he knew he had to change her life. But what starts as a simple act of gratitude spirals into a world of ambition, jealousy, and a shocking betrayal that threatens to destroy them all. This is the story of how one call transformed a life and how one woman's compassion saved a family. The rain fell on the windows of the Daily Grind diner in a relentless, unforgiving rhythm, mirroring the storm inside Alistair Finch's heart. From the supple leather of his chauffeured Maybach, the world was a muted, water-streaked blur. But inside the diner's worn vinyl booth, everything was painfully sharp. The smell of stale coffee, the clatter of cheap cutlery, the low murmur of conversations he couldn't care less about. Alistair was a man who commanded silence. In his boardrooms, a slight narrowing of his eyes could halt a multi-million-dollar presentation. His name, whispered in the halls of finance from New York to Hong Kong, carried the weight of a king's decree. Yet here in this fluorescent-lit purgatory, he was deafened by the one sound he couldn't bear, the silent weeping of his 8-year-old son. Ethan wasn't sobbing. It was worse. He sat perfectly still, his small shoulders rigid in his ridiculously expensive private school blazer from St. Cuthbert's Academy. His gaze was fixed on the swirling pattern the condensation made on his glass of water. A single tear escaped his eye, tracing a path down his pale cheek before he quickly, almost shamefully, wiped it away with the back of his hand. Then another. And another. Ethan. Alistair said his voice softer than he intended, yet it still sounded like a command. The burger is getting cold. The boy didn't look up. I'm not hungry. It was always the same answer. For 6 months, ever since Eleanor had been stolen from them by a sickness that even Alistair's billions couldn't defeat, Ethan had been a ghost in their cavernous penthouse. His laughter, once the vibrant echo in their lives, had faded into this crushing stillness. Alistair had tried everything he knew how to do. He bought him the latest gaming consoles, a pony he'd never ridden, a trip to Disney World they'd never taken. He was trying to fill a void with things, because the language of feelings was a foreign dialect he'd never been forced to learn. Eleanor had been his translator. Now he was lost. Today had been particularly brutal. It was the parent-teacher conference. Mr. Henderson, a man with kind eyes and a weary expression, had shown Alistair Ethan's drawings. While other kids drew superheroes and rocket ships, Ethan drew grey, formless shapes and a stick figure of a boy standing alone under a weeping willow. He's isolating himself, Mr. Finch, the teacher had explained gently. A boy named Marcus Thorne has been particularly unkind. He calls Ethan the ghost boy. Today he told Ethan that his mum left because she didn't love him anymore. The rage that had surged through Alistair was so potent, so absolute, he could have bought the school and fired the entire faculty on the spot. But he saw the fear in Ethan's eyes, the plea to not make it worse. So he had simply nodded, taken his son's hand, and left. He'd told his driver, Robert, to just drive. They ended up here, at this relic of a diner Ethan had pointed at, perhaps because it looked so different from their sterile, perfect world. And now his son was crying because of a cruel taunt that had sliced right to the bone of his deepest fear. Alistair felt a familiar, bitter cocktail of fury and helplessness. He could orchestrate a hostile takeover of a Fortune 500 company, but he couldn't shield his son from the playground malice of a 9-year-old. It was then that he saw her. She moved between tables with an economy of motion that spoke of long owls and aching feet. Her uniform, a pale blue dress that had seen better days, was immaculately clean. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail, but a few stray wisps had escaped to frame a face that was defined by a quiet exhaustion. She wasn't classically beautiful, not in the way the women in Alistair's circle were, with their surgically perfected features and curated elegance. But there was a kindness in her eyes, a deep, gentle watchfulness that seemed entirely out of place amidst the clatter and grease. Her name tag read Clara. She was taking an order from a table of boisterous truckers when her eyes flickered over to their booth. It was a fleeting glance, nothing more. But she saw it. She saw what Alistair, sitting 2 feet away, was only just beginning to comprehend. She saw the profound, bottomless grief of a little boy. A few minutes later, she approached their table, a pot of coffee in one hand. "More coffee, sir?" she asked Alistair, her voice low and pleasant. "We're fine." Alistair said, his tone clipped and dismissive. Clara didn't flinch at his coldness. Her gaze had already shifted to Ethan. She looked at the untouched plate, the trembling lower lip, the tear that had just begun its descent. Instead of walking away, she placed the coffee pot on an adjacent table. She knelt, bringing herself down to Ethan's eye level, a move of such simple, profound empathy, it stunned Alistair into silence. "Hey there," she said softly, her voice a balm. "That looks like a 5-star chocolate milkshake you've got, but it seems to be missing its whipped cream crown. That's a serious offense in this establishment." Ethan sniffled, looking at her for the first time. His blue eyes, so like his mother's, were watery and lost. Clara didn't push. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just gave him a small, conspiratorial smile. Then, with a fluid motion, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a clean, folded napkin. With a tenderness that felt almost sacred, she gently reached out and wiped the tear from Ethan's cheek. "Sometimes," she whispered for his ears, only though Alistair heard every word, "the rain has to fall to make way for the sun." For the first time in months, a flicker of something other than sadness crossed Ethan's face. He watched her captivated. She gave his shoulder a light, reassuring squeeze, stood up and retrieved the coffee pot. "Let me know about that whipped cream," she said with a wink, before turning and walking away, as if nothing had happened. Alistair sat there poleaxed. The gesture was so small, so insignificant in the grand scheme of the universe. A napkin, a gentle touch, a few kind words. But in the desolate landscape of his son's grief, it was like the first bloom of spring. He watched as Ethan picked up a French fry and tentatively took a bite. Then another. He looked back at the waitress Clara. He saw her refilling sugar shakers, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw the slight wear on the soles of her shoes. He saw the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes. She was just a woman doing her job likely for minimum wage plus tips. But she had accomplished in 30 seconds what he had failed to do for half a year. She had reached his son. A new feeling began to displace the anger and helplessness, a powerful driving sense of purpose. He was Alistair Finch. He reshaped markets, built empires, and bent the world to his will. He believed that every problem had a solution, every variable an equation. This woman, this stranger, had provided a moment of grace. And Alistair Finch always settled his debts. He took out his phone, a sleek black device that was his scepter and shield. He discreetly took a photo of the waitress as she worked behind the counter. He sent it to a single contact, David Chen, his head of security and personal fixer. The text was simple, direct, and held the promise of immense power. Find out everything about her. Her name is Clara. She works at the Daily Grind diner on 6th Street. I want to know her dreams, her debts, her history, everything. As he put the phone away, he looked at his son, who was now quietly finishing his burger. The storm outside hadn't ceased, but inside the diner, for the first time in a very long time, it felt like the rain was starting to let up. And Alistair knew, with absolute certainty, that he was about to unleash a hurricane in Clara's life. David Chen was a man who existed in the digital and physical shadows. He was a ghost in the machine, a whisper on the wire. For Alistair Finch, he was an extension of his will, a tool of surgical precision. The request was unusual. It wasn't about a corporate rival or a hostile board member. It was about a waitress. But the directive was the same: dissect a life, lay it bare, and present the findings. Within 12 hours, a sleek encrypted file landed in Alistair's private inbox. The subject line was simply, "C. Evans." Alistair sat in his home office, a space that overlooked Central Park, from a godlike vantage point. The city lights twinkled below like a fallen galaxy. He opened the file, and the life of Clara Evans unfurled before him. Her full name was Clara Ann Evans, age 28, born and raised in a working-class neighborhood in Queens. Her file wasn't a story of criminality or intrigue. It was a quiet symphony of thwarted dreams and suffocating responsibility. The first document was a letter of acceptance to the Rhode Island School of Design, RISD, one of the most prestigious art schools in the country. A full scholarship. The second document was her withdrawal notice, dated just 1 semester in. The reason was listed as family medical emergency. David had dug deeper. Clara's mother, Sarah Evans, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of multiple sclerosis. Her father had died years earlier, and Clara was her only child, her only caregiver. The next 4 years of Clara's life were detailed not in achievements, but in hospital visitation logs, pharmacy receipts, and schedules for physical therapy. She had worked a series of low-paying jobs, cashier, barista, office temp, to keep them afloat while managing her mother's round-the-clock care. The art, her passion, was relegated to a few charcoal sketches in a worn notebook found through a search of her social media footprint. They were portraits mostly of her mother, capturing not just her likeness, but the slow, painful erosion of her vitality. They were heartbreakingly beautiful. The final chapter of that story was a death certificate for Sarah Evans dated 2 years ago. It was followed by a mountain of medical debt, over $90,000 that the insurance hadn't covered. A lien had been placed on her mother's small house, and it was eventually sold to cover a fraction of the cost, leaving Clara with the remainder, a crushing weight she was chipping away at $50 or $100 at a time from her meager earnings at the Daily Grind. She lived in a tiny rent-controlled apartment in a 5th-floor walk-up. She worked double shifts 6 days a week. Her bank account balance was a cruel joke. $317,042. Alistair leaned back in his Eames chair, the leather sighing under his weight. This wasn't just a kind waitress. This was a woman who had sacrificed her entire future on the altar of familial love. She had a gift, a scholarship-worthy talent that was now being used to sketch sandwich specials on a chalkboard. The injustice of it was galling an inefficiency in the system of life that offended his sensibilities. He felt a pang of something he couldn't name. It was a resonance. He had all the money in the world, but it couldn't save Eleanor. Clara had no money, and she couldn't save her mother. They were both survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to different pieces of wreckage. His mind, however, didn't linger on sentiment. It moved to action. He saw the problem, the variables, and the optimal solution. The debt was a number. The lost opportunity was a locked door. Alistair Finch owned the bank and held all the keys. He picked up his phone. He didn't dial a bank or a collections agency. He scrolled through his contacts to a name that hadn't been called in years, Julian Croft. Croft was the owner of the Croft Modern Gallery in Soho, a kingmaker in the contemporary art world. His opinion could launch a career or sink it into oblivion. He and Alistair had moved in similar circles, once a world of charity galas and acquisitions before Eleanor's death had made Alistair a recluse. Julian answered on the second ring, his voice as smooth and polished as the marble floors in his gallery. Alistair, to what do I owe this blast from the past? Julian. Alistair began no time for pleasantries. I have a business proposition. It's an investment, a patronage, if you will. I have discovered an artist, a complete unknown. I want to give her a solo exhibition at your gallery. There was a stunned silence on the other end, then a dry chuckle. Alistair, you can't be serious. We are booked 2 years in advance. I have a waiting list of established artists. I don't just give solo shows to unknowns. It would be professional suicide. I'm not asking you to give it to her. Alistair clarified his voice, dropping to the register he used when he was not to be trifled with. I'm funding it. I will cover the entire cost of the exhibition, the space rental, the marketing, the catering for the opening night, everything. You will take no financial risk. Furthermore, I will personally purchase the centerpiece of the collection for my private collection at a price that will guarantee the show is a commercial success before the doors even open. Let's say 7 figures. The line went quiet again. Julian was a connoisseur of art, but he was also a businessman. An exhibition with zero financial risk, backed by Alistair Finch with a guaranteed $1 million sale. It was unheard of. Who is this prodigy? Julian asked, his voice now laced with cautious intrigue. Someone from Yale's MFA program, a student of Hearst. Her name is Clara Evans, Alistair said, and she works at a diner on 6th Street. The silence that followed was so profound, Alistair could hear the faint buzz of the connection. This is a joke, Julian finally managed. My checkbook is never a joke, Julian, Alistair stated coldly. You will receive a portfolio of her work within the hour. My assistant will be in touch tomorrow to finalize the contracts. The show will be in 3 months. Find a space in your schedule. He didn't wait for a reply. He hung up and forwarded David's file with Clara's sketches to Julian Croft. He then sent another message to David Pay off the entirety of Clara Evans' outstanding medical debt, anonymously, and arrange for the delivery of a cashier's check for $50,000 to her apartment. List the sender as the RISDA Alumni Benevolent Fund. Make it untraceable. He had solved the equation. The debt was gone. The opportunity was presented. He had repaid his son's tear with a new life. It was clean, efficient, transactional. A problem fixed. The next evening, Alistair went to the diner himself. He left his driver a block away and walked in the bell above the door, announcing his arrival. Clara was at the counter, polishing silverware. She looked up, and a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Good evening," she said, her smile professional, but weary. "Just one—" "Yes," Alistair replied, taking a seat at the counter. He didn't want a booth. He wanted to be right there. "Coffee." "Please." She poured him a cup, her movements deft and practiced. As she set it down, he spoke. "My son, Ethan. He enjoyed his meal yesterday." Her expression softened instantly. "Oh, the little boy with the serious eyes. I'm glad. He seemed like he was having a tough day. "He was," Alistair said. "You were kind to him." "Thank you." "It's nothing," she said, a faint blush on her cheeks. Everyone deserves a little kindness. Here it was, the moment to deliver the solution. He reached into his Brioni jacket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. He slid it across the counter. "My name is Alistair Finch," he said, watching her face for a reaction. There was none. She clearly didn't recognize the name. "I've become aware of your past, Ms. Evans, your talent, your time at RISD." Clara stiffened. Her eyes, moments ago warm and open, became guarded. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I've made an arrangement," he continued, ignoring her denial. "Julian Croft of the Croft Modern Gallery has agreed to host a solo exhibition of your work in 3 months' time. He's very eager to see what you can produce. All expenses will be covered. This is your chance to reclaim the life you were meant to have." He delivered the words like he was closing a deal, expecting gratitude, perhaps shock. What he got was ice. Clara stared at the card, then back at his face. Her expression was a mixture of confusion, fear, and profound suspicion. She took a step back from the counter, her hands clutching her apron. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "How do you know about RISD? Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" Alistair was taken aback. He had given her a gift, a golden ticket out of this life of drudgery. He had expected tears of joy, not an interrogation. "I want nothing," he said, his tone becoming defensive. "I am simply providing an opportunity." "Nobody provides an opportunity like this for nothing," she shot back, her voice gaining strength. "People like you don't just walk into diners and hand out art exhibitions to waitresses. This is some kind of sick joke. Or you're a creep who has been stalking me. I want you to leave. Now." She pointed a shaky finger toward the door. The transactional perfection of his plan shattered. He had calculated the finances, the logistics, the outcome, but he had completely forgotten to calculate the most important variable of all her, the human element. He had seen her as a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. And in her wary, frightened eyes, he saw the full magnitude of his miscalculation. The aftermath of Alistair's offer was a silent, deafening explosion in Clara's life. She spent the night sleepless, her mind replaying the bizarre encounter. A billionaire, a name she'd had to Google to comprehend the sheer scale of his wealth, had appeared in her diner and offered her the one thing she'd buried so deep she'd almost forgotten she wanted it. It felt less like a miracle and more like a trap. The world she knew, the world of unpaid bills and aching feet, didn't contain such sudden, benevolent plot twists. The next morning, 2 things happened that tipped her world completely off its axis. First, a letter arrived from the hospital's billing department. She opened it with the usual sense of dread, expecting another stark reminder of the debt that shadowed her every waking moment. Instead, the letter stated that her account in its entirety had been settled by an anonymous benefactor. Her balance was 0. She read it 3 times, her hands shaking. It felt like a clerical error, a cosmic mistake. Then there was a knock at the door. A courier delivered a thick envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $50,000 made out to her name. The sender was listed as the RISD Alumni Benevolent Fund. She'd never heard of such a thing. Clara sank onto her lumpy sofa, the check and the letter spread out on the coffee table before her. It was too much. The timing was too perfect. This had Alistair Finch's fingerprints all over it. He hadn't just offered her an opportunity. He had unilaterally dismantled the cage of her life. He had paid off her past and tried to buy her a future all without her consent. The gesture meant to be liberating felt like a violation. It made her feel small, like a project, a charity case. Her pride, the one thing she had left that was entirely her own, stung fiercely. Meanwhile, in the Finch penthouse, a different kind of turmoil was brewing. Ethan was quiet at breakfast, pushing his cereal around his bowl. "What's on your mind, champ?" Alistair asked, scrolling through market reports on his tablet. "The lady from the diner," Ethan said, not looking up. "The nice one. Clara." Alistair looked up, surprised. "What about her? Is she okay?" Ethan asked. "You were talking to her yesterday. You looked angry." Alistair put down his tablet. He hadn't realized Ethan had been watching so closely from the car. "I wasn't angry, Ethan. We were just having a discussion. Can we go see her again?" The request was so simple, so direct. Alistair saw the hope in his son's eyes. This wasn't just about repaying a debt anymore. Clara had become a symbol of something for Ethan, a moment of warmth in his cold new world. Alistair realized he couldn't just walk away from this. His solution had been rejected, but the problem, his son's loneliness, remained. And Clara was inexplicably part of the new equation. He decided to change tactics. The blunt force of his wealth had failed. Perhaps a more delicate instrument was required. He had David Chen arrange a meeting, not at the diner, not at his office, but on neutral ground, a quiet corner in the American Museum of Natural History, by the Great Blue Whale. He sent the invitation to Clara via a simple, formal email, with a single line added at the end. "My son Ethan would very much like to see you again." Clara was torn. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to send the check back, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But the mention of Ethan... She remembered his sad, watery eyes. She remembered the weight of the world on his small shoulders. She couldn't say no to him. She found them standing under the massive suspended body of the whale. Ethan's face lit up when he saw her. He ran to her, not to hug her. He was too reserved for that, but just to stand close. "Hi," he said shyly. "Hi, Ethan." Clara replied, her voice filled with a warmth that was entirely genuine. "I've always loved this room. It feels like you're at the bottom of the ocean." Alistair watched them, feeling like an intruder. Clara was wearing simple jeans and a sweater, but she seemed more at ease here than he did in his tailored suit. "Ms. Evans." Alistair began his tone more measured this time. "I apologize if my approach was indelicate. I am a man who solves problems directly. I see now that this was not a problem to be solved, but a person to be consulted." "You paid off my debt," she said, her voice low and accusatory. "You sent me a check for an obscene amount of money. You tried to buy me a career. You did it all without asking. I was repaying a kindness you showed my son," he countered. "In my world, that is how debts are settled." "This isn't your world, Mr. Finch," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And I am not a line item on your balance sheet. The money, it's too much. I can't accept it." "It's already done," he said simply. "Then I'll pay you back," she declared. "Every cent. I don't want to be indebted to you." It was then that Ethan spoke up, his small voice cutting through the tension. "She made the tear go away," he said, looking at his father. "On my face." The simple, profound statement hung in the air between them. Alistair looked from Ethan to Clara. He saw the fierce pride in her eyes, but also the exhaustion. He saw the wall she had built around herself, and he finally understood that he couldn't just knock it down. He had to give her a reason to open the door. "Don't think of it as a debt to me, then," Alistair said, his voice changing, losing its corporate edge. "Think of it as an investment, not in a charity case, but in a talent that the world should see. The money is a grant to allow you to work. The exhibition is a platform. What you do with it is entirely up to you. If you succeed, you can pay back the grant from your sales. There are no strings attached, only one condition. Clara eyed him suspiciously. What condition? Spend some time with Ethan, Alistair said. Not as a nanny. He has one of those. As a friend, he connects with you. An hour or two a week. We could visit a museum walk in the park. Let him see you sketch. That's all I ask. This was the twist she never saw coming. He wasn't asking for her gratitude or for some unsavory arrangement. He was asking her to be a friend to his lonely child. How could she refuse that? She looked down at Ethan, who was watching her with an expression of desperate hope. Okay, she said softly. On those terms, I'll think about it. That evening, a new player entered the game. Alistair was at a sterile corporate dinner he couldn't avoid. Seated beside him was Victoria Sterling, a senior VP from a rival tech firm they were considering for a merger. Victoria was everything Clara was not. She was polished, sharp, and flawlessly beautiful, with a mind like a steel trap and ambition that burned like a furnace. She and Alistair had been seeing each other casually for a few months. It was a relationship of convenience, a pairing of two equals in the corporate stratosphere. You seem distracted tonight, Alistair, she said, her voice a low purr, as she placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. Just a few things on my mind, he said vaguely. Anything I can help with? She pressed. The merger, perhaps? No, it's a personal matter, he replied. Victoria's smile was bright, but her eyes were analytical, constantly scanning for information, for leverage. A personal matter. Don't tell me you're finally taking a day off. I've made a patronage, he said, deciding on the term. I'm sponsoring an artist for a show at the Croft Modern. Victoria's eyebrows shot up. This was new. Alistair wasn't known for his frivolous patronage of the arts. How fascinating. Anyone I know? I doubt it. Her name is Clara Evans. Victoria mentally filed the name away. Later that night, in her own minimalist apartment, she did what Alistair had done. She hired a private investigator. Victoria Sterling did not believe in coincidences, and she did not tolerate variables she couldn't control. Alistair Finch was the biggest prize of her career, both professionally and personally. She had no intention of letting some unknown artist get in her way. A seed of connection had been planted between Clara Alistair and Ethan, but in the shadows, a poisonous weed was already beginning to grow. Accepting Alistair's terms was like stepping through a looking glass. One day, Clara was wiping down sticky tables. The next, she was standing in the middle of a vast, sun-drenched art studio in Tribeca, the keys to the space feeling impossibly heavy in her hand. The studio, of course, had been arranged and paid for by Alistair's investment. It was a pristine white box with soaring ceilings, a wall of windows, and the faint, intoxicating smell of turpentine and possibility. It was more space than she'd had in her entire apartment. It was her dream rendered in brick and glass. And it was terrifying. The first week she did nothing. She would arrive, make coffee, and just stare at the giant empty canvases that Alistair's assistant had delivered, along with a seemingly infinite supply of the finest paintbrushes and materials money could buy. The freedom was paralyzing. For years, her art had been a secret act of rebellion, sketched in stolen moments in a cramped corner of her room. It was fueled by grief and frustration. Now, with expectation and a state-of-the-art studio, the well of inspiration felt bone dry. She was drowning in the opportunity. Imposter syndrome was a constant nagging whisper in her ear. You're a fraud. You're a waitress playing dress-up. Her weekly meetings with Ethan became her only anchor. Alistair was always present, a quiet observer standing a few feet away, ostensibly reading emails on his phone. But Clara knew he was watching, listening. They would go to the Met, where Clara would show Ethan her favorite paintings, explaining how Van Gogh used thick swipes of paint to show the wind, or how Rembrandt carved light out of darkness. She'd bring a sketchbook, and as Ethan sat beside her contentedly munching on a snack, she would draw. Not the grand, important pieces for the exhibition, but simple things, the fossil of a dinosaur, the stoic face of a stone sphinx, the way Ethan's hair fell across his forehead. In those moments, the pressure would vanish. It was just her, the boy, and a piece of charcoal. She saw how Ethan's curiosity slowly unfurled. He started asking questions, not just about art, but about her mum. They found a common language in their shared experience of loss. "Did you cry a lot?" he asked one afternoon, as they sat by the pond in Central Park. "All the time," Clara answered honestly. "Sometimes I still do. It's like a leaky faucet in your heart. It just drips sometimes." Ethan nodded, understanding completely. "Dad doesn't cry," he said. "He just gets quiet." From his position by a nearby tree, Alistair overheard this. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the two of them, the woman he'd plucked from obscurity, and the son he was failing to reach, and felt an unfamiliar pang of envy. Clara was giving Ethan something he couldn't, a vocabulary for his grief. Alistair found himself looking forward to these outings more than any business meeting. He saw a different side of Clara, not the wary waitress or the overwhelmed artist, but a woman of quiet strength and profound empathy. He noticed the way she'd tuck a stray hair behind her ear when she was concentrating on a sketch, the genuine, uninhibited laugh she let out when Ethan told a silly joke. He was drawn to her authenticity, a quality as rare as a flawless diamond in his world. The shift was subtle at first. He'd start to participate, asking Clara a question about a painter's technique. He'd share a memory of Eleanor, something he hadn't done with anyone. A fragile bridge was being built between the three of them, suspended over a canyon of grief. This budding connection did not go unnoticed. Victoria Sterling received her own dossier on Clara Evans, and it painted a picture that she found both pathetic and deeply threatening. A charity case. A nobody. Yet Alistair was spending personal time with her and his son. Victoria understood power, and she knew that emotional access to a man like Alistair Finch was the ultimate currency. Her first move was a calculated visit to the studio. She arrived unannounced, dressed in a sharp crimson sheath dress that made Clara in her paint-splattered jeans feel like a bug under a microscope. "So this is the workshop of the great new prodigy," Victoria said, her voice dripping with condescension as she surveyed the empty canvases. "Alistair has invested quite a lot in you. I hope you're not going to disappoint him." "I'm working at my own pace," Clara said, her chin held high, though her hands were sweating. "Of course," Victoria purred, running a finger along a pristine workbench, checking for dust. "It's just that the art world can be so brutal. Reputations are made and shattered overnight. A show at the Croft is a major league event. It would be a shame for Alistair's judgment to be called into question if his pet project were to fail." The term pet project was a poisoned dart, and it hit its mark. Every insecurity Clara had rushed to the surface. Victoria's campaign was one of subtle psychological warfare. She began to appear more frequently. She'd, coincidentally, be at the same park, joining their walks with Ethan, inserting herself between Clara and Alistair. She would talk about board meetings and stock options topics designed to exclude Clara and reinforce her own status as Alistair's peer. She'd compliment Clara's sketches with backhanded remarks. "Oh, that's so charmingly rustic. It has a certain amateur purity to it." To Ethan, she was cloying and artificial. "Do you like my new shoes, Ethan? They're from Italy." He would just shrug and move closer to Clara. Victoria saw this, and her resentment hardened into something uglier. The pressure began to take its toll on Clara. The joy she found in sketching with Ethan would evaporate the moment she stepped back into the silent, judgmental emptiness of her studio. She began to work feverishly, trying to force the art to come. The results were stiff, lifeless. They were technically proficient, but lacked the heart and soul of her old charcoal sketches. She was trying to paint what she thought a real artist would paint, not what she felt. Alistair noticed the change. The easy laughter during their outings was gone, replaced by a tense preoccupation. "Is everything all right, Clara?" he asked one day, after she'd been staring at the same painting at the Frick collection for 10 minutes without really seeing it. "It's just the show," she deflected. "It's a lot of pressure." "You don't have to do this," he said, surprising himself with the words. "If it's making you unhappy, we can call Julian. You can walk away." Clara looked at him, startled. "And what? Go back to the diner? Live off your charity? No. I have to do this. I have to prove—" She stopped herself. "Prove what to whom?" he pressed gently. "Prove I'm not just your pet project." She thought the echo of Victoria's words ringing in her ears, but she couldn't say that. "To myself," she said instead. That night, Victoria made her next move. She was having dinner with Alistair at a Michelin-starred restaurant. "Darling," she began, swirling the wine in her glass. "I'm worried about you, about this Clara situation." "There is no Clara situation," Alistair said coolly. "Isn't there? You're spending a great deal of time and capital on her, and I paid a little visit to her studio today. There's nothing there, Alistair, just empty canvases and fear. I think you've been taken in by a sob story. She's in over her head, and when this show fails, and it will fail, it's your reputation on the line. People will say you've lost your touch, that you're being led by sentimentality. It could affect the merger." Alistair's eyes narrowed. "My reputation can withstand the failure of one art show." "But can it withstand ridicule?" she countered smoothly. "And more importantly, what about Ethan? You've allowed him to get attached to this woman. When she crashes and burns and disappears from your lives, he'll be hurt all over again. Is that fair to him?" It was a brilliant, vicious move. She had weaponized his two greatest vulnerabilities, his public reputation and his private love for his son. A seed of doubt was planted. Was he being sentimental? Was he setting Ethan up for another loss? His business instincts, cold and logical, warred with the new fragile emotions Clara had awakened in him. He was a billionaire, a titan, but he was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and he was beginning to realize that he had locked Clara in there with him, and now a predator was circling outside. The doubt Victoria planted began to fester. Alistair became more reserved during his outings with Clara and Ethan, his phone reappearing more frequently, his mind clearly elsewhere. Clara felt the shift immediately. The fragile bridge between them seemed to sway the connection, becoming faint and staticky. She interpreted his distance as disappointment, a confirmation of Victoria's taunts. He was an investor checking on a failing asset. This fear galvanized her. She poured all her anxiety, her frustration, and her flickering hope onto one monumental canvas. It was a portrait, but not of a person. It was a portrait of a moment. She painted the interior of the daily grind, but not as a drab, greasy spoon. She painted it as she had seen it in her best moments a sanctuary. She depicted the warm golden light pooling on the worn countertops, the steam rising from a coffee cup like a prayer. And in a booth, she painted a small boy, his face turned away, but the slump of his shoulders conveying a world of sorrow. And standing beside him, a woman's hand, her own hand, gently resting on his shoulder. It wasn't a photorealistic piece. It was impressionistic emotional. It was about the quiet dignity of service, the power of a small kindness in a loud world. She called it Sanctuary. It was the first piece she had created that felt true. It was the breakthrough she had been desperately seeking. For the first time, she felt a surge of confidence. She could do this. The rest of the collection started to flow from that source. She painted the tired but hopeful faces of her fellow waitstaff, the beauty in the mundane, the nobility of a working life. Her studio, once a symbol of her fear, was finally becoming a home. Victoria, however, was not idle. Through her investigator, she had learned of Clara's progress. The whispers from the art world sparked by Julian Croft's calculated leaks were growing. People were intrigued by the mystery of Alistair Finch's protégé. A successful show for Clara would solidify her place in Alistair's life, a position Victoria coveted with a terrifying intensity. She decided that subtle sabotage was no longer sufficient. She needed to burn the whole thing to the ground. Her plan was both simple and diabolical. She found out that the studio building a renovated warehouse had an old, barely up-to-code sprinkler system. Its one weakness was a manual shut-off valve in a little used maintenance closet in the basement, a relic from a previous era. Her investigator, a man with flexible morals, was paid handsomely to find a disgruntled, recently fired security guard from the building's management company. For a few $1,000s, the ex-guard was more than willing to provide a master key and a blind eye. One night, a week before the exhibition's opening, Clara worked late, putting the finishing touches on Sanctuary. She left around 2 a.m., exhausted but exhilarated. The collection was complete. The paintings were arranged around the room, a testament to her journey. As she locked the door, a wave of profound gratitude washed over her. Alistair had given her this chance. She finally felt worthy of it. An hour later, a shadowy figure let himself into the building's basement. He turned the heavy cast-iron wheel of the sprinkler valve until it was tightly shut. Then he went up to the 3rd floor, used the key to silently enter Clara's studio, and went to work. He didn't use an accelerant that would be easily traced. He simply took a collection of oily rags used for cleaning brushes, piled them in a corner behind the largest canvases, and lit them with a simple match. He didn't stay to watch. He just closed the door, walked out of the building, and vanished into the night. The fire started slowly. It smoldered, a creeping, insidious thing. By the time the smoke was thick enough to be noticed by a passing patrol car, the heat had built to an inferno. The fire department arrived quickly, but their efforts were hampered. When they hooked up to the building's internal sprinkler system, nothing happened. They had to run hoses up the stairs, losing precious minutes. Clara was woken at 4:30 a.m. by a frantic call from a number she didn't recognize. It was the fire marshal. She arrived to a scene from a nightmare. The street was a tangled mess of fire trucks and police cars, their lights painting flashing demonic strokes against the pre-dawn sky. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from the windows of her floor. Her heart seized in her chest. "My work!" She gasped to a firefighter trying to push past the barricade. "My paintings are in there. Ma'am, you can't go in there. The floor is unstable. We contained it, but the smoke and water damage is extensive." She stood on the cold pavement, wrapped in a fireman's coarse blanket, and watched the sun rise on the smouldering ruins of her dream. Everything, the long nights, the struggle, the breakthrough, the hope had been turned to ash and slurry. Tears streamed down her face, mingling with the soot that seemed to hang in the air. It was over. Victoria's words echoed in her head. When this show fails, and it will fail. She had been right all along. The call to Alistair was the hardest she'd ever had to make. Her voice was a broken whisper. "It's all gone," she managed to say. "There was a fire. It's all gone." Alistair was silent for a moment. Then his voice came hard as flint. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she sobbed. "But the paintings—" "To hell with the paintings," he said with a ferocity that shocked her. "I'm on my way." He arrived 20 minutes later, looking as if he'd been carved from granite. He found Clara sitting on the curb, her face streaked with tears and soot, staring blankly at the ruined building. He sat down next to her, the tailored trousers of his $1,000 suit grazing the grimy asphalt without a second thought. He didn't say, "It'll be okay." He didn't offer platitudes. He just sat with her in the ruins, a silent, solid presence in the wreckage of her world. Victoria heard the news later that morning. She called Alistair, her voice a perfect symphony of feigned shock and concern. "Alistair, darling, I just heard. It's absolutely tragic. Is she all right? Oh, that poor girl. After all her hard work, it's just a terrible, terrible accident." "Yes," Alistair said, his voice cold and distant. "A terrible accident." But in Alistair Finch's world there were no accidents. There was only cause and effect, action and consequence, and as he sat beside the devastated woman who had somehow become essential to his and his son's happiness, he made a silent vow. He would find the cause, and the consequence would be biblical. He looked at the smoking building, and for the first time in a long time, the cold, calculating mind of the billionaire predator fully awakened. This wasn't a failed investment anymore. This was an attack, and he would find the arsonist who had kissed his world with fire. Alistair Finch dismissed the fire department's official report of an accidental fire as bureaucratic fiction. He knew this was an attack. He gave his security chief, David Chen, a single, ruthless command. Find who did this. Use any means necessary. David's team moved with surgical precision, bypassing official channels. Within 48 hours, the puzzle was solved. They found proof the building's sprinkler system was deliberately disabled, confirming arson. They tracked a hired professional to the scene, and through a web of shell corporations and encrypted payments, followed a digital money trail that led to one source, Victoria Sterling. The motive was sealed when they recovered a file from her cloud server, a background check on Clara, revealing an obsessive jealousy. While the digital evidence was damning, the final blow came from a more personal source. Alistair was trying to console a devastated Ethan, who finally revealed why he distrusted Victoria so deeply. He recounted a threat he had overheard in the park when Victoria had cornered Clara. "He'll see you for the worthless nobody you are." She had sneered, her voice dripping with poison. That confession transformed Alistair's mission from business to a deeply personal vendetta. This wasn't just an attack on a project. It was an attack on his son's fragile peace of mind. Victoria had used his own child as a pawn in her cruel game. When David presented the complete, irrefutable file, Alistair reviewed it in cold silence. The grieving father receded, replaced by the ruthless predator who had built an empire. His grief had hardened into a diamond-hard resolve. Victoria wanted to play with fire, and he was about to show her what it felt like to be burned to the ground. "Get her in my office tomorrow morning," Alistair said to David, his voice dangerously calm. "Tell her we're ready to finalize the merger. Tell her it's the most important meeting of her life." Victoria Sterling entered Alistair Finch's office, her victory so close she could taste it. She found him standing like a statue against the skyline, his back to her. Alistair, she began, her voice a confident purr. It's time we put this unpleasantness behind us. You're right, he said, turning. His face was a mask of cold fury that made her falter. The unpleasantness is over. He gestured to the large screen on the wall, which flickered to life. It showed a silent, damning montage, her private investigator meeting a security guard, bank transfers from her offshore account, and finally, a clear photo of her PI lighting a pile of rags in Clara's studio. Victoria's blood ran cold. That's not... I can explain. Save your lies. Alistair's voice cut through her like glass. You didn't just commit arson, Victoria. You threatened a good woman in front of my grieving son. You fundamentally misunderstood what I value. He stepped towards her, his presence suffocating. As of this morning, my hostile takeover of your company is complete. You're fired. A file detailing your crimes is on its way to the district attorney. You are ruined. Now get out. She fled his office, not with a whisper, but with the shriek of her entire world collapsing. Alistair found Clara in her small apartment, packing what little she owned into cardboard boxes. The air was thick with defeat. It's over, she said, her voice hollow. There's nothing left to show. You're wrong, he said softly. He held out his phone, displaying a high-resolution photo he'd taken of her masterpiece sanctuary. This is left. Your courage is left. He told her everything about Victoria's calculated cruelty and the war he had waged in the shadows for her. Why? She whispered, her eyes full of tears. Because you showed my son and me that the sun can come out after the rain. He said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer hid. You brought hope back into our lives, Clara. Don't let her be the one to burn it down. A fire ignited in her eyes, one of defiance and creation. 1 week later, the art world gathered at the Croft Modern Gallery for a show they would never forget. The exhibition was titled From the Ashes. The walls were not filled with paintings. They were covered in monumental charcoal drawings Clara had created with a feverish intensity. She had drawn the skeletal remains of her studio, the determined faces of firefighters, and in the place of honor, a breathtakingly detailed drawing of a hand cupping a single matchstick. From its tiny flame, a flock of phoenixes rose, taking flight across the wall. The show was a triumph. Across the hushed, reverent room, Alistair watched her, his son Ethan, holding her hand tightly. He had made one call intending to repay a debt, to fix a problem with money. But this woman with nothing but her spirit had given him and his son back their lives. Standing together, bathed in the warm gallery lights, they were no longer a billionaire, a waitress, and a lonely boy. They were a family forged in fire and reborn. In a world that often measures worth in dollars and cents, Clara Evans proved that the true value of a person lies in their capacity for kindness and the strength of their spirit. Alistair Finch, a man who had everything learned, that what he truly needed couldn't be bought. It had to be earned through trust, protected with loyalty, and built on a foundation of simple human connection. Their story reminds us that you never know how a small gesture, a gentle word, a helping hand, a moment of shared understanding can ripple outward, changing lives in ways we can barely imagine. It proves that even after the most devastating fires, the most beautiful things can rise from the ashes. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story moved you, please let us know in the comments below. What was your favorite moment? Don't forget to hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful tales to the world. Until next time, remember to look for the light, even in the darkest of moments.